Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. Before I start, do you like the new picture in the background? There you go, have a look at that. My wife painted that. She sold the last one that was behind me, which I liked a lot of, but this is quite good too. Anyway, in this video, what we're going to do is take a look at my January reading wrap up. 4 classics for you coming right up. So without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? The first book that I read in January was Hammond Inn's The Lonely Skier. I don't know if you know Hammond Inns. He's sort of a classic in the thriller, suspense slash adventure sort of genre. Inns himself used to be in the British Army, and actually just before he was demobbed, he went on a skiing expedition with the army, which he said was the toughest thing he had ever done, harder even than any battle training. And he takes that experience and puts it into this story. It's he writes very much in the vein of sort of Desmond Bagley. I don't know if you've read Desmond Bagley's book. Actually, he would be a good person to do a video on because he's very much a classic in this genre as well. But in the story, you have a chap called Neil Blair who's just been demobbed from the British Army and is looking for work. And while he's looking for work in London, I think he goes into a shop in Piccadilly and he bumps into a chap called Derek Engels. Now, Engels used to be his battalion captain. And Engels says, "Oh, you're looking for work, are you?" Now, Engels is like a rough and ready, straight to the point, you know, doesn't care less what other people think kind of chap. But there's a respect that Neil's got for him. And anyway, he says to Neil, "You're looking for work?" And he says, "Yes." And Engels says, "Well, I've got a job for you for 2 months if you want pay." And he's like, "Well, what's the job?" He says, "Not really important." He says, "What are you up to now, Engels?" Engels is a filmmaker now, and he's made it big with this new film. And he says, "I've got something else I'm working on." But he says, "What I want you to do, I'll give you good money. I want you to go over to Italy, northern Italy, to a little sort of isolated chalet hotel near the town of Cortina. And all I want you to do there is to pretend you're writing a script for a film, but I want you to just watch the people who are there. Especially," and he hands him a photograph, "the Contessa Fratelli." Now, just by the by, if you notice, when it comes to like a lot of foreign names, you want to fall into an accent, even if you can't speak the language. You know, I said Contessa Fratelli, but you want a Contessa Fratelli. You know, it's like, you know, Alexander Dumas. You're sort of Alexander Dumas. I don't know what it is we want to put an accent on. But there you go. Off goes Neil to this chalet just above the town, and it's got a slitovia. I think that means a ski lift, sort of a mechanical crank lift that goes up this steep slope. It's heavy snow. And he goes there and he sees a bunch of different characters. So he sees this small Italian dandy in his silk shirts and sort of foppish behaviour. And he's accompanying the Contessa. So he's interested in this. But while he's there, someone else walks in, a character called Maine. I think he's Irish. Maine and this Italian chap, they look at each other. His name's Valdini, the Italian. And Neil swears that they recognise each other. Then a Greek chap called Karamikos comes in. And he seems to take another end of the room as if he recognises people. They're all surprised that they've turned up in the same place. And so the story develops, and Neil gets pulled in because he goes to an auction where this chalet is being sold, and there's a hotelier expecting to buy it from the town, but there's secret bidders who pay ridiculous sums of money to buy this very small, innocuous chalet. So he begins to research it, and he knows that there's something linked to an ex-Nazi criminal. Always a good thing to throw into a thriller plot, isn't it? And wait for the name, Heinrich, very original. So he's involved, but he can't quite work out how. And the story then progresses. Now, although he's not involved, he gets in danger because everyone's suspecting each other of having an agenda, and there's people that move about in the shadows, and there's an incident where he walks outside at night and sees a light shining out of a little isolated engine room, and he's like, what's going on there? And he gets close to being spotted. And then there's a fascinating bit where he's taken off on a ski trip over a mountain to go sightseeing with this character Maine, and that doesn't go well at all, and you learn something terrifying about snow if you don't know about snow, like the different kinds and what can happen to you. Really interesting. And so it just sweeps along until the whole thing boils to a crescendo. In fact, Derek Engels turns up, and then there's guns and shots and all sorts of things going on, and I won't spoil it, I was about to say something else then. And who are all these people? And who is Carla Rametti? Carla Rametti. That's the actual Contessa, but who is she? How is she linked to all this? And how is she linked to Heinrich, the dead Nazi, who used to live in this area? Well, you'll have to read it to find out. Now, is it a great book? No, it's not. Would I say you've really got to read this? Absolutely not. It's one you could very quickly miss. This is sort of a proto-James Bondish kind of novel. One thing I appreciate about Innes is he used to do his research by engaging in the things that he wrote about, so he could really write from experience. So yeah, he did skiing, like I said earlier. But when I say this is a proto-James Bond, it's proto in more ways than one. It's earlier than James Bond, of course, so you've got that action-adventure. But also, to steal Richard III's words, it's curtailed of that fair feature, deformed, unfinished, half-made up, sent before its time into this world. So, not a great book, but interesting, and it was certainly enough to make me want to read more of Innes, because he's got a very nice, quick pace. He doesn't linger around looking at the landscape too much. He wants to get on with the story. It's not about real life, it's about a mystery, who done it, what's going to happen, will anyone survive, who will die, and will the good guy win? That's pretty much your basic story. So, that was the first book. The Lonely Skier. Have to deduct some marks actually from calling it The Lonely Skier. Not exactly a grippy title, is it? But The Lonely Skier by Hammond Innes. The next book whose pages I fingered and lines I scanned was Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, that classic from 1980. And yes, that's 40 years ago, so falls into what I class as part of the criteria for being a classic. It was a really interesting book. I don't know if you've read it. 570 pages long, approximately. Beautiful cover, by the way. Check that out by Vintage Classics. Good job there. I'll tell you the background of the story first, the plot. It's 1327. We are in a monastery in a remote Italian place, outside an Italian town. And there's a lot of turmoil going on in the Catholic Church. You know, there's schisms at this time. This is the time when you had two popes. So you had the Pope ruling from Avignon and you had the Pope in Rome, one supported by the Holy Roman Empire and the other one supported by the King of France. Now this plays in, but that's not what the plot's about. Basically, an English monk, former inquisitor, who doesn't like the torturous methods that inquisitors use to get confession. He's sort of affected by Bacon and Occam's up-and-coming ideas of using reason, not just superstition. He's invited by the abbot of this monastery to attend for a particular reason. And when he gets there, he finds out what the reason is. A young novice has plummeted to his death off the high walls, which are on a cliff, of the monastery. And he wants to know who killed him. And Baskerville, because he's got this ability to reason and deduce, is renowned for this. That's why he's been called in. So he sets to work, but there are inhibitions laid on Baskerville. And Baskerville has with him his apprentice, a little lad, a young man called Adso. And the narration is through Adso's eyes. And I think that's what makes this book so interesting, is because we see Adso growing as a youth, not necessarily just in the cloistered monastery, but the dark of the world has entered the monastery. And he's exposed to corruption and sin. And they soon determine that this first character has committed suicide. And that could be the end of it, until they find somebody's leg sticking out a barrel of pig's blood. And then obviously something more sinister is happening, because that's not normally the way someone commits suicide, by diving in pig's blood. And there's this progression then, and it goes through 7 days. At the heart of the whole thing is this building called the Edificium. It's a hexagonal building and it holds the scriptorum, so where the monks copy books out, keeping a copy of them all. And there's this renowned, world-renowned library that is the pride of the monastery. But what's so great about this library is it's a labyrinth. It's designed as a labyrinth. So if you're not initiated into the secrets, you can walk in there and get completely lost. And everyone, apart from the librarian and his apprentice, is forbidden to go into the library. But that's where Baskerville realises a lot of the mystery is coming from. All the murders that happen in this are connected somehow back to the library. And he wants to get in. But how do you get in when the abbot won't let you? Well, he wants to go anyway. So here's a question. How do you work out how to get through a labyrinth? Because a maze is to prevent you from getting to somewhere. It's to prevent you from getting in. That's what a maze is for. A labyrinth is different to a maze in that it's designed to not let you escape. So how they work out how the labyrinth is constructed and the way to read it is fascinating. I mean, it's really, really good. But this is where I want to give you a heads up if you want to read this, because it sounds exciting, right? What makes this different from just a standard murder mystery is that Eco plunges you into the 14th century. This is not a murder mystery in which some characters have lives. This is life in which there is a murder mystery. Totally different way around. And that's why it doesn't read like a normal murder mystery. Umberto Eco himself, professor in semiotics and in medieval religion. I think he studied religion at Divinity College. He is very versed in all of the arguments of the day. You will have Franciscan monks, you will have the Dominican monks, you will have the Minorites, you have this character called, what's his name? Brother Dulcino. He is sort of this figure in the background who some people used to follow, and the church thought it was a terrible thing because these people basically gave themselves up to licentious wantonness. And all these schisms and religious arguments, they keep popping up throughout the story, and it seems almost irrelevant, but what he's doing, Adzo is pulling you into his world. He's listening to the learned men of his day discussing scripture, discussing politics. A lot of it unrelated to the murder, most of it in fact. And so you're seeing him growing in this world. On top of that, you've got sort of the behaviours of the monks, things that they get up to under the cover of darkness. The attitudes of certain ones in their discipline towards religion. Now, particularly, you have in here a guy called Jorge. He's a Spanish monk, hence not Jorge in Portuguese. And he is blind, and he is sort of ever fluttering about the scene. A very angry character who doesn't like laughter. And this actually is one of the written texts within this book, the importance of laughter and authority. That in itself was a really interesting one, but it sort of makes you squeeze your lemon a bit to try and get your head around it, that there's a message there about laughter and authority, which maybe if I do a full book review of this, I'll bring that up. But this is one deep book, and it is full of Latin phrases, like whole paragraphs in Latin. Now, I can't read Latin. Most of you watching won't read Latin, but do you know what? It's brilliant because it puts you in the monastery. Imagine you went back in time and you could speak Italian, but you couldn't speak Latin. You would hear all of this. And Adzo is experiencing it. Now, it all culminates, yes, the mystery is solved, but the way it culminates is just so honey sage. You know, that bitter leaf within a sweet tincture. Just the way he's writing this at the end of his life, Adzo, looking back at this mentor that he had, Sir William Baskerville. Just the very end almost made it worth reading just for that. The poignancy of a reflection on life past. But that's not the point of the book. It was just, I loved the way it ended. Would I recommend it? Yes and no. If you want to read a murder mystery for a good thrill and whodunit, don't read this. It's a decent murder mystery, although I'd pretty much cottoned on quite quickly who did it. But I couldn't prove that. How it was done was very interesting. I worked that out before it was told as well. Not saying I'm clever at murder mysteries, I often am not. But like I say, this is life in which a murder happens or a sequence of murders happen. It's not a murder mystery just for its own sake. It is a book I would encourage people to read, but set aside some time. This is not a rip-roaring read. This is one to patiently go through. There are passages which are really going to have you hooked. Like I say, everything to do with the labyrinth is great. And some of the evocation of atmosphere and the sinister suspense where you just know they're going to find a body. You just know it. That's really good to feel. But you also need to be patient because, like I say, there's a lot of discussion of things that are going on within the church between the higher members of the orders, and there's a visiting inquisitor who turns up because that's also going on. So yeah, there's a lot of deliberation around what we would call mundane things, but it all adds to that experience, and you see it through this young man's eyes. So he is learning the ways of life too. He is gaining experience in life as he goes. I liked it, thought it was a very, very good book, and absolutely loved the cover, so it looks really nice on the bookshelf. The third book that I read in January, and by far and away my favourite, was Balzac's Old Goriot, or Old Man Goriot as the French would say. This was just a delight to read. It was fascinating, and the more it went on, the more drawn in I felt, and yeah, a sense of the world, an idea about the world came to mind, which I was forced to evaluate again. A common idea, but really well executed in this, and I'll tell you what it is in a minute. But first, the plot. So, Old Man Goriot lives in a pretty deadbeat area of Paris in the boarding house of Madame Vauquer. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Vauquer. V-A-U-Q-U-E-R. Now, she's a grasping old lady, you know, she wants money. And when he first moves there, he seems to be well-to-do. He takes up lodging on the third floor apartments, which have a little bit of a view above some of the houses. And he's got this beautiful silver set. And she fancies herself as maybe nabbing him as a husband. Wouldn't that be lovely? But as soon as that doesn't work out and he turns down one of her friends, she thinks he's a crusty old so-and-so, and instead of calling him Monsieur Goriot, which she used to, she now calls him Old Goriot. The whole boarding house is full of a bunch of other people. I think it's up to 18 people. You don't necessarily meet all of them, but you know it's in the morning when they have breakfast and in the evening when they have dinner. There's lots of chitter-chatter and banter and, you know, maybe some squiffy / drunken nights where they all enjoy some wine and party. But they've all got their own little lives running on. But it revolves around Goriot and a young lad called Eugène Rastignac. And he's come from the country. He's technically from a noble family, but he's barely got any money. But he's been sent to learn law in Paris so that he can raise his family out of their almost poverty. But he gets drawn into the different way of life in Paris, not the law, but he gets invited to see one of his cousins who is a leading light of Parisian society. She knows nothing about Rastignac, but he meets her and she decides to take him on. She actually says, for any young man to advance in Parisian society, he needs a woman to pave the way for him. So some grande dame. And so she begins to do that. Now, at the same time, Goriot, you think, where's he got his money from? Well, it turns out he was a vermicelli merchant. So he used to make vermicelli from wheat. And that's something to talk about if I ever do a deep review of this, which I hope to. That in itself is interesting, that he's a vermicelli merchant of all things. Because otherwise, why pick a vermicelli merchant? How odd. He's got these two daughters, Anastasie and Delphine. And they keep, you know, occasionally they visit him. And the members of the boarding house think, who are these beautiful girls visiting Old Man Goriot? He says they're his daughters, but they're like, yeah, whatever. He's got a little bit of lucre. I bet he's a bit of a, pervert, dirty old man. Eugene Rastignac ends up going out into society and he meets Anastasie. He goes to her house. He actually makes a fool of himself because he doesn't conduct himself like proper Parisian society, and he's never allowed back into their house. But he does learn that Anastasie is Goriot's daughter. He also learns that Goriot never gets to see her. But whenever she needs money, because it turns out she's got a lover on the side, even though she's married, it's Goriot that bails her out. He absolutely adores his two girls. He got money, and then with that money, I think the dowries were 800,000 francs he gave to noble men so that his girls could enter into high society. And his attitude was, well, I don't need money. I don't need a palace to live in. I can live in this boarding house as long as my girls are happy. And so Rastignac begins to learn this young lad, and he begins to admire Goriot's self-sacrifice. He also begins to learn of the hypocritical, self-serving, sort of egocentric attitude of high society. And it's interesting to watch his view of the two daughters, because he also meets Delphine as well. In fact, he falls in love with Delphine. So how does all that work out? Then you've got a guy called Vautrin. And he is sort of a spooky guy. He's full of bonhomie, he's full of good humour and wit, but he lives in the boarding house. But he sort of gets drawn to Rastignac, this young man. He sees him as a man who wants to make his way in society. There's sort of a clash of ideals at some point. Rastignac talks about virtue being the correct thing, and Vautrin, with his wily ways, his worldly ways, and his much greater age, says no, the only mark of virtue is success. Success is virtue, and how you get there doesn't matter. Rastignac's sort of eyes are opened as he realised the world is not fair. It's quite corrupt if you want to get to the top. But Vautrin comes up with a plan to make Rastignac rich, to marry a very, very rich heiress who happens to be living at this boarding house. Now you might be thinking, why would a rich heiress be living at a boarding house? Well, you'll have to read it to find out. And you'll see how the temptation of wealth and of prominence and fame pulls on a naive heart. How it pulls a young person away from the ideals of virtue and doing what is right, to wanting to just succeed. And that's what's so interesting about this, because on the other side, while he's got Vautrin sort of working on him, because Rastignac's quite ingenuous, you've also got the example of old Goriot, who will sacrifice anything to make his daughters happy. Now that's not self-serving. And the whole thing really revolves around Rastignac's interpretation of the different modes of living and ways of getting ahead, and what is right and wrong, and what is money and power and fame all about. And interestingly, big twist with Vautrin, which you probably won't see coming, but I won't spoil that for you. This was a great book. I'm sorry I can't go any further because there's a lot I want to say, but I don't want to spoil it. There are certainly some big thought-provoking ideas in here about, more than anything I would say, about the effect of money on one's morals and attitudes towards living. Just to say, this is not a standalone book. I don't think it's the first one, but it's very early on in what Balzac would term the comédie humaine, so the human comedy, where he looks at pretty much every single area of life, different characters. And what I find fascinating is Rastignac in this one. The book is standalone on itself, but it's also part of this 20 books which you can read. Rastignac appears later in another book, but unlike in a normal book where you just have a character appear from nowhere, appear from the ether, when you find Rastignac in the later book, you're actually going to know a whole backstory of him. You're going to have a book that was all about him and old Goriot. And that fascinates me. Reading 20 books in a series daunts me because I like to chop and change and go everywhere. But also, the way he wrote it really does make me want to read all the others. So, have you read Balzac? What did you think? Have you read Old Goriot specifically? If you haven't, pop that one on your list. It's a good book. The fourth book I read in January was very, very interesting, and it was Manon Lescault by Antoine-François Prévost, if I'm pronouncing that properly, trying to catch that for the R's in French. Prévost. Now, he's better known as Abbé Prévost because he was an abbé. So, this book follows the life of the Chevalier de Grue, I think is how you pronounce it. A young lad who, at the age of 17, he's supposed to make his way in Paris. He's been sent by his noble father. But he meets, en route to Paris, this young girl called Manon Lescault. And she is beautiful. And he basically runs off with her. And they go to Paris. And they're living together. He wants to get married to her, but he should think of asking his father first. But he's ditched all that. And his father doesn't know where he is. And he stays there, and it's their life together. And the difficulties that they encounter, in fact, the word fortune and fate appear all the time through this book. So that's clearly something that's on Prévost's mind when he's writing this. Because the problem with Manon is that she cannot bear the idea of living in penury. If she's got money, she loves her man the most. She is in love with him. But whenever there's a struggle for money, she does something which is quite hurtful. And you first see it very early on in the book when the Chevalier de Grue, he comes home and he's not let in by his housemaid until someone scampers down the back stairs. A Monsieur B / doesn't name him. And he realises that she's been unfaithful. And so he's irate and he runs off and he goes back to home and he tells his old friend Tiberger that all the things that have happened and why he got misled and that it's not the law he's going into, it's religion. That's right, be a priest or something. And Tiberger, who's very moral, he's like, well, you've learned your lesson now, it's okay. But when he goes back to Paris, he finds Manon again. And they get back together because he loves her. Now, he now knows he has to keep her in money. It's not just because she loves money. She loves him, but she can't live in poverty. And so he meets her brother. Her brother introduces him to some rakes, some gamblers, who teach him how to fix cards so that he can make money. Despite this, another tragedy hits him when the house that he's got with Manon burns down. And so he's got no money again, and guess what happens to Manon? They actually play a trick on an aristocrat. She doesn't sleep with him, but she strings him along, gets given sort of some expenses that mistresses used to get, quite a lot, 20,000 francs I think it was, and then they run off. But they're caught, and she's put in like a nunnery, and he's put in like a monastery, not to be religious, but they're locked up, they're interred. And he's itching to see her again, and you see him break out and go and find her again. And there's this constant coming together, and then disaster, and then rising above it, and disaster. And like I say, he talks about being followed by an evil star. The journey will then take them, because of her reputation, they are deported, or she's deported, and this is where the narrator first sees her. When you first come into the story, he's seeing her being led along by some guards with this young lad in tow, because he can't give her up. He loves her too much, too deeply. Even though his friend Tiberger is constantly saying, leave her. She's leading her down a track of vice. You always come to corruption. But he can't do that. And Tiberger is a loyal friend. He keeps giving him money anyway. But she's led off and deported to New Orleans, I think it is. Somewhere in America. And he goes with her and they make life anew. But as with everything, there's a couple of, things are going okay and they decide they want to get married. And when it becomes apparent to the governor in New Orleans that they're not actually married, they assume they were, the governor's nephew thinks, oh, she's a pretty lass, I want her hand in marriage. So we've got this problem again. And so this moves Manon and her chevalier to run off again. And it culminates in, just a beautiful, beautiful way. Tragic, but beautiful, moving. And I'm not going to give you all there's tons that goes on in between all this, obviously. But the way it climaxes is just great. It puts you in mind of Defoe, Daniel Defoe. You think of Moll Flanders, the way that she goes through society, through her ups and downs, but how unfair society is to a fallen woman. But that's not as simple as what the book is about. When you look up people's ideas of themes on Manon Lescault, it's varied. People talk about it's about life, it's about death, it's about morality, it's about not fitting in with society, it's about money, it's about love. The problem I have with saying these are all themes, a theme should really grip a whole ensemble of work. It should be the whole work. What happens here is people are just saying this passage here is love, this passage here is money, this passage here is prostitution. That's not themes, that's sort of mini motifs. The theme of this, I do think, remembering it's written by a religious guy in 1731, by the way, it was scandalous at its time. He did add some moralising afterwards, but I don't think he needed to. Whatever you love the most, if it's not goodness, and I suppose from Abbé Prévost's idea that would be God, Tiberger, the guy's friend, he's very godly. He's not sanctimonious, I wouldn't say, but he's very clear-headed, and although he sort of relinquishes some of the pleasures of a debauched life, he is still a good guy, and he's not hit with all the tumult that his friend is. And I think that this is something that comes through. And this is why it's so powerful. Even though it was written almost 300 years ago, when you read it, ask yourself the question, what is my first love in life? And ultimately, even though she was in love, but she needed money, and that caused endless troubles because it caused her to act unfaithfully against her guy. The Chevalier's first love is Manon. But you would think loving a person as the top thing in your life is the best thing to do. What's wrong with it? And yet it drags him through pain all the way through the book. And how it culminates, what's the message in that? You will have to read it. It is brilliant. I said that old Goriot beat all the books I read hands down. I shouldn't say hands down. Stylistically, being as it's written in 1731, Manon Lescault is not as fluid and as readily recognisable as a novel, the way the story is structured, the characters are fleshed out. It's a narrative, which is, although it's supposed to have all the emotion of the guy narrating, it's still a purely narrative piece of work. But as a thought provoker, yeah, very, very good. So would I recommend Manon Lescault? Absolutely, absolutely. Is it going to be the most pleasurable read? Not the most pleasurable read, but a great story. And you can imagine if it was written just 100 years later, how it would have been such a brilliant, brilliant read. Because the story is impeccable. Just the way we're used to reading. It's very, very similar to a lot of the 18th century writers. So that was my fourth one. What books did you read this month? Let everyone know down below. Any classics especially, put those down below and, recommend to me ones that you really think were good and that I should look at. And until the next time, I will wish you joy in your reading.